and welcome to I'm Your Biggest Fan, the podcast that chats to your favourite artists about their favourite artists. I'm your host, Jazmin L'Amy, in conjunction with the Noizze podcast network and sponsored by Satanic Tico. On today's episode, I'm chatting with guitarist and vocalist Michael Rubin of New York city-based groovin' hard rock trio King Falcon. Despite King Falcon being inspired by the likes of Royal Bloods, the Black Keys and Tame Impala, as evidenced on their recently released debut self-titled album on Mascot Records, Michael's all-time favourite band would surprise you. The jangly guitar and attitude-laden riffs that pour out of him were first realised and honed with his love of 70s American rock band Steely Dan. Basically, the whole premise of this interview, the podcast is called I'm Your Biggest Fan, and I imagine that as a musician you get asked the same old questions all the time. It's the same rehashing every tour, every album cycle, every EP cycle. And I find that with the advent of social media, a lot of people forget that their favourite bands started out just as fans like them. So the whole idea of this is to delve into the band that makes you fanboy the most. Back to your childhood, back to when you first discovered rock music.
Sure.
So yeah.
That's way more interesting. I think that's a great premise. I'm excited about it. Yeah, you're right. I've been in so many interviews where it's just like, so tell me, about the album and tell me what this song's about. And then you do it so many times. I mean, it's cool, the album just came out, but it is always kind of the same sort of interview, so I'm very excited.
Yeah, and hopefully it will kind of relight that fire and the reason you got into music in the first place.
Yeah,
so I've been told that the band you want to talk about today is Steely Dan.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because first of all, Steely Dan is like my favorite band ever and has been for such a long time. But King Falcon sounds nothing like them.
Yeah.
Worlds apart, but I mean, you can kind of draw inspiration from totally different places and then, speak your own language when you interpret it. But yeah, Steely Dan is probably my favorite band. It's probably tied up there with Pink Floyd. Those are like 1 and 2, but Steely Dan is really, it's definitely up there.
Yeah, amazing. So do you, like when you were growing up, do you remember the first time you ever heard Steely Dan?
So, not really the first time, but I remember the first time that I sort of, that it was really introduced to me, but I don't remember the first song that I heard. I was a music student at School of Rock, which is, I'm sure you've heard of it. It's kind of like the movie, but it's a real thing.
I did exactly the same thing when I was a kid.
Yeah, totally. So, I mean, you get it. Yeah. And at some point, I don't know, when I had gotten kind of knee deep into the program, one of the older students was playing something that just sounded totally out of this world. It was a keyboard student. And obviously it makes sense because with Steely Dan, the genius is the keyboard. Yep. So I heard him play a chord progression. And I was like, what song is that? And then, kind of from there, I just like always had an obsession with Steely Dan, because what was cool about Steely Dan is they had this intense musicianship. Like everything was really tight and all of their chord progressions are really original, but they never lost the melody and the groove. Like if you listen to prog rock, which Steely Dan is not, it's yacht rock, and they're different for sure. But if you listen to like Frank Zappa or like, I don't know, like Yes or like Tool or like any of these really complicated bands, musically and technically they're very sound. But I find over the course of like a 7-minute excursion, you're in many different lands and there's no like a lot of times you lose that cohesion and you lose that melody that kind of makes a song memorable and it makes a song. Yeah. Whereas I feel like Steely Dan can do that no problem and still have melodies and hooks, and it's all about the songwriting. So I think being able to have both of those in one band is what makes them so good.
Yeah, of course. And how old were you when you were doing School of Rock?
So I started when I was 10, and I was kind of on my own thing by the time I was 16, 17.
Oh, that's cool. That's like really similar to what I did when I was younger. That's really cool. I didn't realize they had like the same kind of programs.
Yeah. So what instrument do you play?
Well, I gave up because turns out I'm not very good at singing.
It's hard. It's not easy.
Yeah, but I did that maybe like 5 seasons, and then I just kind of like just stopped practicing and fell off. But yeah, I met one of my best mates through it as well, so it was cool.
Yeah. That's how I met the other guys in the band. Where they're teachers there. So once I graduated, I became a teacher there, and I met the other two guys through School of Rock. So it's really, I think you'll find 5-10 years from now, a lot of the rock bands that are coming out will in some way be related to School of Rock. Like even older bands I'm seeing now, they have session guys in the band who are School of Rock teachers. I mean, everybody's like really tied to it somehow, and it's cool. You know, School of Rock and Guitar Hero, I think, single-handedly brought back rock and roll.
Oh, absolutely. I find as well, like, because I don't know what it was like where you were growing up, but I grew up on a really small, tiny island between England and France. And I was like the only metalhead, the only rock and roller I knew. So finally, like going to a place where like all the weird kids finally came together and like discovered each other was pretty cool. Um, but yeah, and as well, do you remember what song it was that you heard?
Uh, it might have been Pretzel Logic. I think
Mhm.
it was Pretzel Logic. But it also could have been Home at Last, or Reeling in the Years. It was one of those three, and I'm not sure which one because they were all kind of around the same time. That was like the first batch of Steely Dan songs. I remember the first Steely Dan song that I had to learn was Kid Charlemagne, and that was for School of Rock. And I remember that song kicked my butt because at the time there was no, like, you couldn't YouTube how to play that. You know, it
Yeah.
was, I don't know, 10-12 years ago, so YouTube was still pretty early. Um, and the second one after that was Don't Take Me Alive, if you know that one. That was the first one I really had to dive into the lead parts on, and that one also kicked my butt. But that one's interesting because it has Larry Carlton playing lead on it,
Hmm.
and he's not on every song. So I don't know how much you know about Steely Dan, but what's cool about Steely Dan is that the core band is only two guys. It's
Yeah.
Donald Fagen and Walter Becker, right? And everybody else was a session musician. And some of those guys hated Walter and Donald because they would make them do hundreds of takes until it was absolutely perfect. But that's why they have the legendary reputation that they do. And I've heard that they're not friendly,
Hmm.
but I think that they've almost earned the right not to be.
If you're talented enough, you have a little bit of leeway.
Yeah, I think it's unfortunate, but it's true. You know, like I understand it. I get it.
Yeah, when I was so I did a little bit of research because what I like doing about these interviews is I work in music full time as well. So I find that unless I'm listening to a band that I'm working or I'm going back to my like childhood bands, I find it really difficult to get into new music nowadays.
Yeah.
So what I like doing about this is it's forcing me to listen to bands that I've heard of, like I'd heard of Steely Dan, and I'd heard the songs reeling in the years, but I'd never like taken the time to like do a deep dive. So I did a little bit, and I was like, oh, I know this song. Okay, now it makes sense.
Steely Dan's one of those bands where you know the songs, but you don't
Mhm.
know they're by Steely Dan.
Yeah, literally that. Like I was
Yeah.
listening this morning, and I was like, just having like epiphanies. Like I've heard this a million fucking times. Now it makes
Yeah.
sense.
And they're a funny band. Like I find everybody either really likes them. There's three sorts of relationships with Steely Dan. One is like you said, where you have no awareness of them, but you hear a song and you go, "I know that." And you hear another song and you know it, and you know like 8 songs, right?
Mhm.
The other is people like me who love Steely Dan, can't get enough. I've got every record on vinyl. I have tape cassettes in the car. I just love Steely Dan. And then you have people that really, really hate Steely Dan and think that they're so pretentious and just can't get over it. And it's funny. I've even seen. I was working backstage at a venue once. I think it was might have been Webster Hall. It was somewhere kind of downtown in New York City. It was a big venue. And I walked up to the soundboard, and printed on the soundboard in permanent writing, it says, "Do not play Steely Dan during the intermission." And I was like, "What?" It was great. It just says no Steely Dan right on the board. It was hilarious. So there's definitely a lot of guys out there who do not like it, but it's whatever, man. It's funny.
I would love to know what Steely Dan did to the person that wrote that down. Like how
Me too.
how severe is that grudge?
I don't know. I will say my and we can obviously move on from Steely Dan. I do listen to other things as well, but I will say my favorite Steely Dan song is a song called Kings, and it's a song that I think not a lot of people know, and it was one that I even discovered like deep into my fandom of Steely Dan. It's called Kings. It's the harmonies and the backup vocals on that song just really make it. It's just such a groove.
Yeah, I don't think I listened to that one, but obviously after this, it's cool to like go back and listen to the songs that you mention and have like a little bit extra info whilst I'm listening to them, which is pretty cool. But
hopefully you like it.
You mentioned them moving on from Steely Dan. This whole interview is about Steely Dan. I hope you're ready.
Oh my, okay, that's fine. No, I didn't know if that was your plan or if you just really wanted to focus on one thing. But yeah, that's cool. We can stay on it.
It's all you can talk about. This is an opportunity for you to talk about your favorite band of all time for like 40 solid minutes.
Oh my God. Okay. Yes. All right.
So you mentioned there as well that your favorite song was Kings. What I find with one of my favorite bands is Guns N' Roses. And my favorite song of all time also happens to be the first song I heard from them because it holds so much like nostalgia and like more meaning behind it. So you said that you discovered Kings deep into your fandom. So what was it about that song in particular that kind of was so different to all of the other Steely Dan songs you heard at that point?
Sure. So there's a couple things. So number one, like I said, is the harmonies on that song are excellent. Number two, I had to kind of Google the lyrics. I mean, I know what the lyrics are, but Steely Dan is interesting because they write about a lot of different sorts of topics. Like they can sort of go anywhere between completely making up a story that's complete fiction, or going based on like an idiom and then writing a song about that, or like some sort of innuendo, like the Fez, if you're familiar with that song. I'll keep it PG, but the lyrics are, I'm not going to do it without, I ain't going to do it without the Fez on. And the Fez is like one of those little caps. And I'll just, if you think about that one, you can figure that one out.
Yeah. The Fez stays on during sex.
Cool. Yeah, well, there you go. So this song is kind of cool because it's there's like a little bit of a historical element is there as well, and kind of like this mysterious lyric thing as well. It's a cool premise for a song, but the thing that got me more than anything else as a guitar player is the solo in the middle of the song. So there's one section where it's I won't get not to get too musically, but he's just kind of moving up in fourths, and it's like it sounds like you ever play Legend of Zelda?
Yes.
You know when you like open up a chest or something and it does that and then the thing,
yeah, like an arpeggio.
That exact arpeggio, yes, but it's in the middle of a Steely Dan song. And I remember the first time I heard it, I thought it was such a bold move and such a daring kind of guitar solo. Like I had grown up listening to David Gilmour and Pink Floyd, and obviously, you know, he's got a lot of special things about his solos, and they're very melodic and they're very memorable. But this was the first time I had heard somebody do something that was like in the wrong key, like just devoid of, just like the song was happening here and there was just a moment where the guitar was over here doing its own thing, and then it kind of came back, and I thought that was so cool. And I'm thinking about that now, even kind of for the second King Falcon record, like how do you make a statement with your guitar solos where you have them rooted in melody and having memorable moments, but you also have like a statement in the middle of the solo that just kind of is like, you know what, here's something that nobody else has done before, and I'm taking a risk here, and you either really like it or you really hate it, which is, it kind of ties in with Steely Dan. You either really like them or you really hate them. So
yeah, they're like,
or
the
you have no
Marmite
idea
of
that
music.
you know them. Yes.
I love that. So you mentioned there as well that like you grew up listening to Pink Floyd. What else were you listening to like before Steely Dan came along into your life?
Sure. So it was a lot of people call it dad rock, and again,
Love
that was
dad
kind of
rock.
the school of rock influence. Like the first album that I listened to in entirety was Pink Floyd The Wall, and it was with my dad, and we listened to it on vinyl. And like the standard experience. I think the only thing I was missing was like a joint, but I was 8, so like I was with my dad. I wasn't gonna be smoking a joint. But that's the setting you can imagine. And after listening to that, I became the kind of kid that was like, I don't want to listen to pop music that's on the radio. There's no guitar in it, like I'm better than everybody.
I
And
feel
obviously,
that.
as I got older, stuff kind of changed. I'm sure I was insufferable as a kid, but it was all kind of in that neighborhood. Like, I liked obviously Zeppelin. I liked the Doors a lot. Again, for the lyricism and just their ability to perform. Obviously, I never saw them live since Jim Morrison died in like 1971 or something, like early 70s. But even just seeing videos of them and just listening to the music, you can imagine how well that translates on stage.
Mhm.
The first new band that sort of captured my attention was actually Tame Impala. I don't know if you're a
Okay.
fan. I
Heard of
love
them.
Tame Impala. I was a fan during Inner Speaker, during Lonerism, like all the early stuff. I'm even a Pond fan, so I go as far back as Pond with Kevin Parker. However, I'm going to go ahead and say what everybody else says. Currents is the best. It is the best album. Is perfect cover to cover. It's such a good record. And what's cool about it is and this is the thing. So King Falcon doesn't sound like Tame Impala, but this is the thing that I took from them, which is having melodic sensibility rooted in like familiar 60s 70s rock. Like there's something Beatlesy about his voice. There's something very like 60s British about his voice, but all of the production and the way that he thinks about everything is very modern. It's something that people haven't done before. So I think when you listen to King Falcon, you'll hear that we are melodically rooted in the same kind of things that we listen to, but production wise, it's a lot more modern. It's a lot newer. And I think that kind of came from Tame Impala. Because when I was growing up, I was like, we have to do everything the old fashioned way. It all has to sound exactly like dad rock because that's what I like. And then I think Tame Impala was the band that sort of brought me into the modern era.
Yeah. I can just imagine you like trying to go find like a 8-track tape deck somewhere to try and record
Oh
with.
yeah. That's me. I like everybody was like I remember one year my mom bought me like a cheap computer recorder. I mean, it was like a $50 adapter that goes to like your computer and you can run GarageBand or whatever. And I never used it because I went out and I literally bought a tape recorder that sounded awful. But I just liked the fact that it was on tape. And I've always been a nerd like this, I'm not sure why, but just I don't know. I like when I can see something work and I understand how it works right away. Like with guitar gear, I mean, you're a musician. There's like some people use like digital gear and it all goes into like you plug your guitar into a computer and you put some programming in and then like you have a guitar sound that comes out. If I can't plug in and then it sounds like what it sounds like, I have to use something else. Like I don't want to sit there and program or anything. I just need for it to kind of like work and like an old tube amp, like it sounds like what it sounds like and you understand how it works and there's no like digital magic inside, like the difference between an MP3 and a vinyl. It's pretty clear how a vinyl works and it's not going to skip out in the middle or like you downloaded a virus when you're trying to convert the YouTube to MP3 file, which happens to me every time, by the way. Every single time I do YouTube to MP3 I get a virus.
It's 2023. Come on, you gotta figure out how to not do that.
I know, yeah, it's bad. Yeah, I do it and then I get pop-ups for weeks later. I'm like, I feel like my own grandpa.
No, I get that. There's something like also like very special about physically having something too. Like I've been not with things like plugins and amps, but I've been the same with like the way I listen to music. Like I grew up on CDs. And it only took me until lockdown 2020 to finally get Spotify. So I was like, I'm exactly the same with like, and like with CDs as well. Like once I buy them, they're mine. Like with something like Spotify, it does not matter how many months, years I pay for a subscription. None of that music belongs to me. If Spotify crashes one day, I got no music.
Right.
Whereas,
so you get it, because I
yeah,
feel the same way. You totally get it.
yeah, exactly. But just with different things.
Yeah, it's weird. I mean, again, it's not like you own the songs, but owning your copy of it, you feel like no matter what happens, like this is my thing, you know. Whereas like when you're paying for a subscription, you're just like in it for as long as you're in it. And not to get too philosophical, but I think it's just as a society, we've kind of shifted from one to the other. You know, we've shifted from buying things that are like very stationary, and this is like the one thing that we have, versus like I'll get a new thing in 2-3 years. Like nothing is permanent anymore. Like I think cars are probably the most apparent thing with that. Like leasing cars used to not be a thing. You know, you just bought a car and that was the car that you had, and you owned it until it no longer worked. And then you got another car. You know, now it's like you lease it, you get a new car every 3 years. You're like subscribing to whatever car company you're using a car from. It's like a rental.
Yeah, it's weird as well. Like I like having my little creature comforts and like having my things. I'm very like not materialistic, but I'm very like I like having this is mine. Like, yeah, I'm the same. But
like your Guns N' Roses cup, I see.
It is like one of 6 that I have. Not the same, but like different things. Yeah, band merch for me is like I fucking love band merch. That's where all my spare money goes, is on band merch.
Right on.
But yeah, going back to what we were saying about what you were listening to before Steely Dan, when Steely Dan did eventually come along, what was it that, because you've mentioned, you know, like they keep the virtuoso elements and like the musical elements whilst also adding like the melody and like catchiness to it. But what else about them just was so different to everything else you'd been listening to up until that point?
So there's 2 things about them that were kind of different. Number one is that as a musician, sometimes you want to listen to something that's a little bit more complicated, that you can kind of like take bits apart. And there's plenty of music that's complicated, but I find oftentimes it's very heavy. Like I'm not a metal guy, as weird as it sounds. Like there's some metal that I like. Like I like Guns N' Roses is kind of hard rock, not really metal, but I like Maiden. I like Metallica. I'm less crazy about the modern metal kind of stuff. Like our drummer really likes Periphery. I'm not a huge Periphery. I mean, I think they're talented. That's just not my thing.
Yeah.
So to get that kind of musicianship, where you can kind of take it apart like a Rubik's cube, is cool, and to have it not be super heavy. And the second thing is just that there is no other band that does what they do. Right. Like, if you think of, I don't know, like if you like Motley Crue, right? You'll probably also like Van Halen. You'll probably also like Guns N' Roses. You'll probably also like 15 other like Cheap Trick. You'll probably love 15 other bands from this era who don't sound
like you're really calling me out here.
But no, they don't sound the same.
Yeah,
but they sound similar, you know. Whereas Steely Dan is kind of lumped into yacht rock, but it's not. I mean, it is, yeah, but yacht rock is a little bit more, a little bit softer. And some Steely Dan songs kind of have that softness, but a lot more of them have that edge where they're like more of a rock band and less of more early 70s and less late 70s. And I think that's really the key of it, is that since they started yacht rock, they're one of the first in that category. They were around kind of between end of the 60s to like 74, 75 was really when they were making their stuff. So the early 70s, everybody's still making rock music, and they were the first ones to do that. And by the late 70s, when everybody caught up, like Kenny Loggins and like Christopher Cross and like, you know, all the other band, like Michael McDonald, who, by the way, was a member of Steely Dan and then left to go start the Doobie Brothers and then his solo career and then feature on everybody else's thing, late 70s. So they were the first ones to kind of do this whole thing, but still tie in some of that rock and roll from 10 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting time period, and no other band does that. If you want that sound, you can't say, oh, Steely Dan sounds like the other yacht rock bands, because they don't. They really stand out. And that's what's cool, is I think that there never will be another band that sounds like that.
Yeah.
And there will never be another band that has that level of musicianship, recording fidelity, and just like, I don't know, they're just cool dudes from New York, and that's the vibe of the music. And being from New York, I listen to it, and it feels very New York. Like they feel like cool cats in 70s Brooklyn wearing trench coats. Like that's what Steely Dan sounds like.
That's the vibe I get.
100%. It's cool as hell. And when you're from New York and you go in the city and you're driving around and you're listening to Steely Dan like in the rain, it's like there are two genres that New York really fits. One is the Frank Sinatra jazz genre, and the other is Steely Dan genre. If you listen to both of those in New York, you just get it.
You cannot get cooler than listening to those two things in New York, driving in the rain.
No. I think Frank Sinatra is maybe a little bit more cliche. That's the one that all the tourists do. But I think Steely Dan is like, as somebody who lives here, that's the one I feel represents me more.
So when you, did you get into Steely Dan knowing that they were a New York band, or did you get into them and then discover they were New York? Because I imagine having them that close to home, especially with them being your favorite band, does it make it feel just that extra bit special knowing that you're from the same place?
So I didn't find out at first, so I found out later, and then once I did, I was like, all right, New York represent, but the thing that kind of separates us is time, because Steely Dan, I did see them live. I saw them right before Walter Becker died. And I mean, it was a great show, but they're obviously very old guys now. But from their heyday, I'm like 40 years removed, so it's not like I was around when they were being cool guys in the 70s making all this stuff. Now they're just like old rock stars who are kind of living on the legacy, which is cool in its own right, but it does feel a little bit removed. So it definitely isn't like it's not so immediate, but the recordings are obviously kind of like they're a forever preservation. Like even now, 50 years later, in America, the number one rock charts are all still Floyd, Zeppelin, and all the same bands, because those are like frozen kind of in that time forever. So
yeah, absolutely. And you slightly touched on it earlier when it comes to King Falcon's stuff. So you've just released your debut full-length self-titled album. Congratulations, by the way. Been listening to it all day today.
Thank you so much.
That's all right. So how has, because you mentioned there, and I find this really interesting, that your core influence sounds nothing like the music that you produce. So are there elements of Steely Dan's music that influences your own music writing?
Sure. I think a lot of it you'll find in the guitar solos. So you won't find it too much anywhere else, but like particularly in songs like if you listen to On Your Soul, the guitar solo in that is very modal. Like it's kind of in a Lydian mode, whereas normally in rock and roll you're kind of thinking like Aeolian or Dorian. I know you're a musician. I know you know what I'm talking about.
These are terms I have heard.
Yes. So just kind of having the courage to kind of break out and do something a little bit more left of center, like I was saying. A lot of that I ripped from Steely Dan, and a lot of the kind of like riffs that are a bit jazzy but rooted in rock and roll. That's kind of what comes from Steely Dan. But what's interesting is, like as I said, all three of us in the band, number one, have very different influences, but number two, don't listen to the bands like we normally get compared to. So the bands that we get compared to genre-wise are the Strokes. We get like the Black Keys, White Stripes, Cage the Elephant, that kind of alt-rock genre. And all of those bands are very cool and they're awesome, but they're not bands that we grew up listening to. They're bands that are kind of a little bit more, modern. So Tom, our drummer, as I said, he's a metal guy. So his number one above all else band is Iron Maiden. He loves Iron Maiden. Yeah, 100%. He's got like every time he buys a new piece of clothing, it says Iron Maiden somewhere. Like he's just that guy. He also listens to a bunch of other things like Casey Musgraves, like 100 Gex. Like he's kind of all over the place. But his his center is really in metal, and particularly like Iron Maiden. James, our bassist, is interesting because when he was growing up, his parents are old Italians, so they listen to old Italian music. So it's not like he got his taste in music from his parents. So he kind of got his taste in music through like video games and through like pop culture and stuff like that. So his favorite bands are Green Day, Sublime, like Streetlight Manifesto, if you're familiar with them. So like a whole bunch of the ska kind of stuff. So when you put us together, you've got me, and I'm very, very classic rock focused. You've got James, and he's very ska and punk rock focused. Like that's kind of his world. And Tom, who's a metal guy, and all of us somehow average out playing alt rock, which is, I'm not sure how it happens, but it is very natural for us. I mean, we're definitely just kind of writing music that we think sounds good and that comes natural to us. It's not like we set out in the studio to sound like any particular thing. I think it's really just a matter of when you take classic sounding rock and roll and then you add modern production to it, that's what alt rock is. So we don't really have terms to define things super minutely beyond that. So everything that is not hard rock or pop has to be alt rock, you know? So I've seen like 10 years ago, I feel like alt rock was more rock and less alt. Now I feel like it's more alt and less rock. So there's a gradient even within alt rock. And I think we're decidedly more on the, like we would be closer to active rock, but not quite. Like I don't wear spikes and leather. So like I'm not active rock. Like I'm not hard like that, you know. And we're not that kind of, like, we're soft boys ultimately in this band. We write about feelings and shit. So we're not active rock, but we're closer than a lot of bands that would be on like alt rock radio.
Yeah, it's so weird that like the subgenre, and it's a subgenre as well, so it should be more specific, but it's wild how different bands can sound under the label of alt rock.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like pop. It's a general thing.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned earlier that you have seen Steely Dan live. How was that? Because obviously I know that throughout their career they started off mainly as like a recording band when they produced most of their albums and material, and then took a hiatus, and then when they did come back they were more touring based. So how was it, like, the first time, or the only time, I guess?
It was the only time I saw them was at the Beacon Theater, which is a great venue here in New York because it is like they show plays in it. It's a theater, and it's a beautiful theater, and it's small. Like everybody that comes to New York wants to see a show at Madison Square Garden. MSG shows suck. They're awful. The sound is garbage, and you can't see anything, and they kick everybody out at 11 o'clock sharp. There's like no encore. That's it. 11 o'clock, you get out. And it, you know, it's like if you want to go see a show where everything blows up and there's, you know, big stage animatronics, Madison Square Garden. But if you want to see a good show, you got to go somewhere else like the Beacon Theater. So it was a really intimate venue. They had a lot of session musicians who were younger. So the two old guys in the band, it was very clear that they were the original members, Donald and Walter. And Walter, I think he had, I'm calling him by his first name like I know him. Like, I feel like I should call him Mr. Becker. Walter Becker, he's up there, and he didn't look that great. I mean, he didn't move around. He was very in one spot, like just holding on to the guitar. Like the guitar was holding him up. He had about 15 guitars behind him that were all different colors, and he ended up not playing a single one of them. He just was playing the one that he was holding, which I thought was really funny, and I mentally pocketed. But that makes sense because he passed only a few months later, so it makes sense that he wasn't in great shape. So like not to poke too much fun at him, but I thought that was strange. Donald Fagen, however, was as cool as I expected him to be, man. He's like this behind the keyboard, man, and he's got like the glasses on inside and his little hat. And he's just like Mr. Cool up there. So Donald Fagen absolutely did not disappoint. His voice is the same as it was. And the band was great. I mean, anybody who's playing with Steely Dan, I'm sure, is top level. But it was a fantastic show. They did all of the Royal Scam album, which was cool for me because it had Kid Charlemagne on it, which, as I said, was like my very first Steely Dan song that I had to learn how to play. And then they did a couple others, they did Reelin' in the Years and whatever after they finished the record. But it was cool to just see them play a full record, cover to cover, live, and the original two guys. Like, it was cool. And that was the second time I've actually seen a band. No, third time I've seen a band right before a member died. I don't know if I've gotten lucky or if I've been unlucky, but
who's the other band?
One was Yes, and the other was Tom Petty.
I see.
So I saw Yes. I was second row, and it was 2 or 3 months before Chris Squire, the bassist, died. And I saw Tom Petty. I think it was his third to last performance. I went with my dad, and he killed it. He looked great on stage. He was running around like he was in amazing shape. And then a couple weeks later, we found out he died. It's wild.
Fuck. You should need to stop going to see older bands.
That's it. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, so I not to put it out there, I wish him the best, but I went to go see Willie Nelson a couple weeks ago because I figured the man's 90 years old. Can't be that much more touring left. I hope he goes on 58 more tours, man. But he's 90.
Yeah, it's gonna start happening. Like, thankfully, none of like my musical heroes are quite there yet, but I know it's gonna happen soon.
It happens to everybody. That is the great inevitability of life.
That it ends.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is gonna get very depressing very quickly. But we also mentioned before that the interesting thing about Steely Dan is that they've only got 2 original members that write the huge majority of the songs, and then they just use session musicians for everything else, which I find is, especially when you've got bands that retain the same lineup for decades, a lot of the time, like you can tell it's written by the same people. And the nice thing about having session musicians is that even if you play the same song, if you've got different combination of people playing it's always sounds fresh because it's always got like a different vibe to it. How different do you think Steely Dan songs would sound if they didn't utilize different people's talents?
I mean, that's a tough question. I mean, because a lot of the short answer is that it would be very different. The long answer is, how would it be different? I'm not sure. It's more a matter of when you're doing a recording like that, you're getting the personalities in the room and you're getting that exact moment. Mm-hmm. So somebody else may have interpreted something differently, and it may have led to different things in the studio, and songs may be completely different. Like I know one, which is a great example, again, is the song Home at Last, which maybe you heard, maybe you haven't. But that has a session drummer on it. His name is Bernard Purdie. Bernard Purdie is, you may have heard of him. I think he's known as the most recorded drummer ever. If not the most, then maybe top 3. He was on a whole bunch of stuff, like pretty much every Aretha Franklin song. He claims he played some Beatles records. I don't know if I believe that. But according to him, he had a sub for Ringo a couple times. I'm not so sure about that, but he's been around. And that particular song has a drum beat on it, which it's a shuffle, but it is known as the Purdie Shuffle because he was he was the first guy to play it. And then everybody else that kind of followed him sort of reimagined that shuffle. You can hear it also on the song Rosanna by Toto. Yeah. So it's the same drum beat. Also, Fool in the Rain by Led Zeppelin. Those are all modified Purdie shuffles that were all kind of based on Bernard Purdie's original shuffle. So that song would be completely different if it wasn't him playing drums on it. Yeah. And the other 2 session musicians I can kind of point out are Steve Gadd. He was another session drummer. He went on to be the drummer for Toto. And again, so that same drum beat that I was mentioning, the Purdie Shuffle, both of those guys played in Steely Dan as well. So Steely Dan actually had a huge impact on so many other bands as well. If you start to trace it back, it's kind of crazy. And then the last session musician who I would point out is Larry Carlton, because he played lead on so many of those tracks. And he was one of those guys that perfectly blended the rock sound and the jazz sound, which is what made Steely Dan Steely Dan. And I'm not sure I could think of any other guitar player off the top of my head who does that. I could think of a lot of other guitar players who are amazing guitar players, you know, like I think Eric Johnson and Gary Moore are tied for me as like number one and also number one best guitar players I've ever seen in my life. But they couldn't do what Larry Carlton did for Steely Dan. I think Kurt Cobain said there was a really good quote. Somebody asked him what he thought about Alan Holdsworth. You know who Alan Holdsworth is? Like the prog rock guitar player.
Explain for people who may not know.
Sure. Yeah. So Alan Holdsworth, he's a prog rock guitar player, and he's got some pretty experimental music that is, I mean, very difficult to play and technically challenging. So somebody asked Kurt Cobain, who I think needs no introduction. Everybody knows that one. Somebody asked him what he thought about Alan Holdsworth. And what Kurt said is, Alan's an amazing guitar player, and I could never play like him. Alternatively, I don't think he could ever play like me, you know, and it's true. Think about a guy who is that technically proficient, you know, doing the Nirvana sound and putting on a show like Nirvana does. I mean, it's crazy, but Nirvana's cool and everybody knows who Kurt Cobain is, but I have to introduce Alan Holdsworth because not a lot of people know who he is. So ultimately, you know, it's about how much of yourself you put into it, how authentic it is, and just like how people react to it, you know, and everybody plays their instrument like who they are. Like, this is the thing that I have learned in years of teaching music, and I'm sure through School of Rock. If you have a student who's like they carry themselves in a little bit of like a jittery kind of manner, and they're just kind of like I don't know, hyper, they're going to play their instrument that way. It's going to be very like ADD playing of their instrument, you know, like maybe something really great for 3 seconds and then like just an inability to focus. Like the way that you are and the way that you speak is the way that you speak through your instrument. You know, if you're Mr. Cool constantly, you're going to be Mr. Cool behind the drums. You know what I mean? You're not going to be looking like you're sweating back there. But, you know, alternatively, if you're not, it's going to reflect itself in the same kind of way. So the music that you hear is really a reflection of the personality of who's playing it as well, to kind of go back to your original question. So how different would it be? It would be super different. And I think a whole lot of other bands would be different. I think Toto would be different. I think the Doobie Brothers would be different. I think a lot of the rock bands in general that followed in the late 70s would be different. I think the entire yacht rock era would be different. I think they're a pivotal band in music history in much more ways than people give them credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I was doing, as I said before, like I did a little bit of research earlier because obviously I want you to speak the most. But when I was like doing my research and I read that, you know, the Doobie Brothers and Toto basically came out of Steely Dan, I was like, oh, I did not know any of this, and now I do, and it's very interesting.
100%. They were just like this hub for great musicians. Like they were like the post-grad program for Berkeley. Like if you wanted to be the best musician in the 70s, you went to Berkeley, you graduated, you were in Steely Dan for 2 years, you put out a record, and then you started your own band, and everybody was like, oh, that guy was legit. Steely Dan vouched for him. Yeah. That's like kind of how they were. It's cool. They're like the badge of honor that any other musician has. And then to actually be one of the members of Steely Dan, it kind of makes you realize why they may have been jerks, because they knew that they were better than everybody else.
Yeah, that's true. I guess they were, very like a prestigious band.
Yeah.
But you mentioned earlier as well, like the lyrical content of Steely Dan. So they're often character based on made up personas, situations, and narratives. But I want to know, if you could create your own character and backstory, what would that look like?
I feel like we're about to play Dungeons and Dragons, and I gotta like choose if I'm like a warlock or like an ogre or whatever.
You got to choose wisely, because this is going to be your character for at least the next 4 weeks.
Oh man, that's tough. I'm not sure. I mean, you know, I think as a songwriter, you like a lot of the King Falcon stuff is definitely about situations that I've directly experienced. But some of it is kind of maybe something I've seen and something that I've interpreted. Like Cadillac's a good example. So Cadillac very literally is about my best friend's car. He's got an old Cadillac that I thought is sweet. But I guess I spent too much time playing Grand Theft Auto because the song is about me stealing that car and going on a car chase, which obviously is maybe less cerebral than some of the Steely Dan stuff. But it was a character that I was kind of thinking about in my head for a minute while I was writing this song, you know.
Living vicariously through your own music.
Sure. And I think a character that most people, that most musicians address a lot is like obviously themselves, but themselves on stage. Because I think any performer has two different personas. Like when I'm on stage, I'm kind of a different person than when I am just sitting here. Like if I'm just sitting here, like I'm kind of an introvert. I don't really like being the center of attention. Like, I don't know. I just kind of I like to observe. I like to just do my thing, you know. But when you're on stage, you have to be Mr. Rockstar. You know, that's my job, is to be the MC, to be the guy that everybody looks at and to kind of direct the room. So you have this like dichotomy of two separate people. And I think the song of ours that sort of describes that most is Set Me Free. Because that song is really about when you're on stage, being on the ride of a lifetime, which is the first line of the chorus, and being on this crazy journey, and you know, playing rock and roll and being on the road, but then constantly being like, but wait a second, I'm totally at huge risk here, and like I have a like you know, choosing this life versus choosing an easier life is not an easy decision.
Yeah.
And you have to not think about that when you're being Mr. Rockstar on stage. None of that matters. You know, the fact that like we spent our last $50 putting gas in the van, that's not important right now. We're the biggest band in the whole world. You know what I mean? Like there's a difference there. And then when you walk back off stage, you're like, wait a second, we gotta, you know, we got to find a hotel room tonight. You know, like we have to be a regular person again. So just this, I don't know. It is certainly a ride, and there are a lot of ups and downs, and that's kind of what that song is about. So that's not really a character, but it is about putting on the character of going on stage. You know, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I'd really dive too deep into making a fictional character for myself. You know, like I don't know. I'd have to get there.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you could say that song is about the breakdown. The mental breakdown can wait until after you've come off stage.
Yeah, reality can wait, man. Like we're on the ride right now. All that shit is not important.
Yeah, literally. So if you had to direct someone listening to Steely Dan for the first time, which 3 tracks would you suggest encapsulates them perfectly? That's a big question.
Well, it depends on the person, but I'll give you my 3 favorite songs. It would be Home at Last would be number 1. Kings would be number 2. And then I think number 3 is a tough one. It would have to be something that's a little bit more recognizable. Like for me, it would be Pretzel Logic, but I think maybe a song like Ricky Don't Lose That Number or Reelin' in the Years is more easily digestible. So if it was somebody like you who is like really a music nerd like me, I would probably recommend Pretzel Logic. But if it was just a casual listener, I would recommend one of the other ones for sure.
Yeah, that's cool. You mentioned as well earlier that like Kings became your favorite song because like it was one of those like hidden gems that isn't really like at the forefront of their discography, which I find quite interesting. So besides the 3 you would suggest people start off on, what like deep cuts, 3 deep cuts would you suggest?
So another one that I would recommend is called The Caves of Altamira. I can't remember what album it's on, but I think it's the second song. And it's cool because there's a lot of daring moves in that song. Like I said, like there's one section kind of right after the first chorus where they kind of go to these syncopated hits and they go just a little bit longer than you would expect them to go. Like usually you expect the middle of a song just like 1, 2, 3, da 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 da. But the middle, it's like 12, man. It's just real long, and they just kind of keep going. And you're listening to it, you're like, oh my god, this part's really going a little bit longer than I expected. And then they hit you with the groove, and it's really really cool. So the chorus is really hooky as well, and it's just a cool song. Now they do have some songs. can't think of the name of the one I'm thinking of off the top of my head, but they do have some songs on that same record that are like a little bit softer than I would like. They sound a little bit more like late 70s yacht rock than early 70s. But that one song is a standout. It's called The Caves of Altamira. That's the one.
What a title name that is as well. That sounds so epic.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean. But you could get away with stuff like that. Steely Dan doesn't have the same mystical quality as Led Zeppelin. But if you think about the aesthetic of Led Zeppelin as a band, they're like the Lord of the Rings. I mean, everything was about like, hobbits and like, Gandalf, the wizard man. And like Iron Maiden is like that too, which is, it's funny because I think sometimes it's cool and other times it sounds a little bit too music theory for me. Like it's maybe just a little bit too much about dragons and war and stuff like that. But it's just like this mystical thing that it's like a spice. If you put a little bit on, it's good, but if you put a little bit too much on, it can kind of get cheesy quick.
Absolutely.
I think sometimes Steely Dan does it perfectly, and other times it's a little bit too. Sounds like music theater for me. And having gone to a college where music theater was big, I've had enough of that.
There's only so much you can take.
There's only so much you could take, man. 4 years of like being with a bunch of band dudes, like playing show tunes. Also, in the last band I was in, we had a keyboard player who would often play like Broadway shows and off-Broadway shows. So anytime we would write together, he was always in the mindset of like show tunes. And sometimes Steely Dan gets a little show tuney for me, which I'm not a fan of. But hey, every band has misses, even Pink Floyd. I'm sure even King Falcon at some point, but not this first record because I think it's killer.
Yes, it is. So I have 2 more questions for you.
Yes, sure.
Are you a fan of band merch? Have you ever owned any Steely Dan merch in your time?
Yes, I still have the Steely Dan shirt that I bought at that show. But it was a long time ago, maybe about 10 years or 12 years or so. I have to check when Walter Becker died. I know it was a long time ago because that shirt has a hole in it. So I no longer wear it, but I still have it.
Yeah.
I do have a lot of band merch, particularly from when I was a kid. Like first time I went to go see Roger Waters do The Wall, I have that shirt as well. The first band I ever went to go see, I no longer have the shirt, but the first band I ever saw was Avril Lavigne. Would you believe that?
Oh, no way. That's amazing.
Because I loved Skater Boy, and I thought it was such a good song, and I was the biggest fan, whatever. So I bought a shirt, but I was a kid. I don't have that anymore. I think you have to buy band merch. And now, actually being a guy who was in a band, I would recommend buying it even more because it's the only way that we get paid. Because the record label takes all the money first, and then if there's any left over, you get a little bit of it, which you could use to feed yourself and pay for the van when it breaks down. But that's kind of it. So every time you buy a t-shirt, you buy dinner for the band.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm exactly the same as well. So it's why I took so long to get Spotify too, because I would rather, like, even though physically buying albums, like the majority of the money goes to the record label, you still get a bigger chunk of the CD than you do to like a stream.
Right.
So always buy the physical stuff.
Yeah, totally.
Okay,
couldn't
so
agree more.
My last question as well is, are you aware of where Steely Dan's band name comes from?
I am absolutely aware, and I've been eagerly awaiting for you to mention. No, it's funny. I wasn't at first, but being a School of Rock kid, I think it only took about 2 or 3 months before one of the other 15-year-olds told me what it was about. And yeah, would you like to tell the nice folks, or would you rather have me do?
I'm gonna give you that privilege of explaining what a Steely Dan is.
Sure. So Walter Becker and Donald Fagen went to school together in New York. I don't remember what college it was, but I know it was in New York. And they, I guess, were reading a book, and a Steely Dan was mentioned in the book. I'll have to check what book it is, but a Steely Dan is a steam-powered dildo. It is a self-pleasure device which is powered by steam. But you know what?
That does not
steam
sound
is better than electricity for the environment.
That's true.
So if anything, I think that it's pretty forward-thinking of them. And they were, I like to think that they were aware of renewable energy. And that was really what it was about more than anything else.
I've had steam burns before. I would not trust a steam-powered dildo.
You got to be hardcore for that one.
That's true. You gotta take it with a pinch of salt. Live on the edge of danger.
And yeah, maybe some ice.
just by the bedside, ready, just in case. Yeah, cool. That's everything I had. Unless you have any other anecdotes that we've not covered.
We have plenty covered. This has been so much fun. Thank you so much.
It's all right. No worries. Thanks so much for chatting with me, and congrats on the album again. I hope you've had a great time writing, recording it, releasing it, playing it, and whenever you're next in the UK, then
if you send me your address, I'll send you a t-shirt if you send me whatever size, and I'll send you a CD so you can own a physical CD of the music.
Thank you for listening to I'm Your Biggest Fan. If you enjoyed what you heard, please don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment, send it to your nan in the post. Every little helps. You can follow us everywhere at biggestfan_pod. Follow me everywhere at Wrathchild_jazz. Noizze at Noizze UK on everything. Noizze Podcast Network at Noizze Podcast Network on everything. And Satanic Tico at Satanic Tico and at Pitch Black Nor. If you have a band member in mind that you think would be perfect for this podcast, perfect for this topic of conversation, or maybe you are the band member and you're the super fan, drop us a comment, drop us an email. All other info can be found below in the description. And thanks again for listening. We'll catch you soon.